Right, well, hello, bonjour, welcome back to the Philosophy Club here in the middle of France, in Little Bretette. Yes, I'll start with my weekly kind of roundup of what I've been up to, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll look at the periodic table and so on, usual thing. And we'll finish with the Tarot of the Gods again. So, yes, I mean, it's officially spring, the hours have just gone back, but it's still a bit chilly here. Far too cold for my taste. But summer is coming, apparently. So, I've been working this week hard at work on the Gospel of Matthew commentary, which is quite a major work. I'm not quite halfway through, but I'm going into a lot. I'm putting in the footnotes, so I'm giving the etymology of a lot of words, the context. I recorded this 10 years ago, but now I'm putting all the details, bibliographic references, and you know, it's really interesting actually. I think I'm of the school that I think follows St. Augustine, because Augustine said that Matthew was the first gospel and that Mark and Luke came later and sort of borrowed things from him and then added bits of their own, and then John came much later and did his own thing. That was Augustine's theory. That was challenged in the 18th, 19th century, particularly in Germany, by you know, biblical critics who said no, Mark was the first. And then they postulated something called Q, which was an unknown source, Quelle in German. So, you know, I've looked at all that, and I think personally I've gone back to the idea that Matthew was the first gospel actually, which is why it's the first in the New Testament Bible editions that most people have. And I think his is a very interesting gospel. So I've been looking at the you know, various important incidents and places, using parables a lot. He quotes Isaiah all the time. He loves Isaiah and also Hosea. He's doing a lot of healings, and the parables are about what is the kingdom of God? How do we find it? And he gives a whole succession of these parables, fascinating stuff, which I've been explaining, you know, in interpreting, shall we say. And also he's accused of having an evil spirit. I mean, the grammaticae, the scribes, are not holding back anything. They're accusing him of being demon-possessed. And they're saying that the reason he can cure people and exorcise people is because he himself is governed by the king of demons, the devil. And therefore he has the power. I mean, that's quite an amazing accusation to make of someone who's, you know, doing his best for the community, healing, helping and so on. And it shows there was this sort of occult warfare beginning quite early on in his work. And very early on, it says that they immediately started plotting to have him destroyed. You know, so like it wasn't looking too good for him. I mean, as far as I can tell from the gospel text, if we accept that it's got some, you know, clues as to what was actually happening, some historical basis. I mean, there are critics that say none of it's true. It was all made up. There are people around saying it was all written by a later Roman aristocrat. It was false. I don't accept that. I think this is a historical document, the New Testament, and that we should read it at least as that. And so anyway, very early on, there's this split between Jesus, the healer, the teacher, the rabbi, the spiritual healer, and people that are trying to bring him down, to destroy him, in fact. Which is very sad, and the implications of that are huge. They're still with us today. I explain it in my commentary as a manifestation of what I call Sophiaphobia. People are afraid of wisdom because it has too many demands. It's much easier just to kind of switch off, turn the telly on and ignore the news, and not bother with life. I know, I meet people that say, oh, I can't be bothered, it's too much, and I think, that is a problem. It's called Sophiaphobia, the reluctance to understand stuff. Whereas Christ is really a teacher of wisdom, he's a teacher of gnosis. He wants his disciples to truly understand. And in chapter 12, when he's just given this series of brilliant parables, he says to the disciples, did you understand that? In other words, he wants people to really get what he's saying. And the disciples say, yes, we got that. But again, I think there's different levels. Among the disciples, there will be some who really got it at a deep level. I think Matthew was one of those. He was, I think, fluent in Greek as well as Aramaic and Hebrew. And Latin. He would have had to correspond with the Roman authorities because he was a tax collector. So he was an intellectual in his own right. So that's why this gospel is so interesting, doing the commentary. And there's another confrontation when these Pharisees and their teachers of the law, the Grammatici, come to him and say, "Teacher, we want you to show us a miraculous sign." It's like they're testing him, like as if he was a stage magician. And he says, "Hey, you've had enough signs. It doesn't work like that." Then there's another very interesting passage when, and this is quite famous, when he's teaching and his mother and brothers are outside and they want to come in. They want to speak to him. And Jesus says, "Who is my mother and who is my brothers?" Pointing to his disciples, he says, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." It's interesting statement, and it occurs in the other Gospels, so presumably it's true. Now, it might seem harsh to some people that think the family is absolutely the core of everything. In my commentary, I'm explaining that Jesus was a planetary teacher, a planetary wisdom elder who'd come to bring us back to this notion of doing the will of the Absolute. He calls it his Father in heaven, and that idea of God as Father is a line through Jewish mysticism, and also in Hermetic mysticism. This idea of God as Father is there in Egypt and in the most ancient Jewish understanding. And so it's obviously true that is what we have to follow. It's interesting, the will of God is what has to be followed. So I explore, what is this will? It's the word thelema in Greek. And this, I think, gives the lie to dear old Luther, who said that no, everything depends on faith. If you believe, if you have faith, then you're saved. Jesus would say to Luther, hang on, just having faith isn't enough. You then have to live it and do stuff. You have to act, do the will of your Father. And at that point, this is the long dialogue between the Catholic and Protestant wings of the Church. The Catholics always said it's not just faith, it's action that follows from faith, which is in the letters of St. James and others. And I think that's just logical, it's common sense. It has to be how you act as well as what your faith is. Trouble with Luther and the Protestants is they made everything an interior act, which then leads to the dissolution of the need for institutions and a church and etc., because everything becomes interior, a matter of faith. And what happens to society when people lose faith, as many people have done today? They have nothing to fall back on. I suppose written documents, constitutions, but that is, I think, an impoverishment. So anyway, doing the will of God, I think, is a great idea. I'd like to bring that back. And I think it's very biblically based, but it's also there in Islam. I think Muhammad was trying to do the same. He was saying, look, let's surrender to the will of God. Let's do that. Not the will of this faction or that faction, or even this religion or that religion, or this cult or whatever. No, let's try and discern the will of the absolute. Obviously, Muhammad didn't have the intellectual sophistication of an Aristotle or a Plato or a Hegel, but he discerned the fundamentals, I think, as I've explained in my commentary on the Quran. But this is what's occupying me at the moment, Matthew, and I'm giving lots of references to, the context. One book that I've come across and I've, been using is very interesting. Is this? I can't stress the importance of this book. It's a history of King Herod the Great by a very great American historian, Peter Richardson. And as a trained historian myself, I can recognise it's a masterpiece because this guy's gone into his sources with an absolute fine-tooth comb. Archaeology, texts, geography. He uses the New Testament as source material, but doesn't, he contextualises it. He says, look, the guys that wrote these Gospels had a particular axe to grind. And he's reclaimed Herod for history. It's really interesting. And what I've learned from this book so far is that Herod was an incredibly sophisticated politician. He was friends with Augustus, the emperor, kept in good books with him. He was also friends with Augustus's rival, Antony, who for a time you weren't sure, was Antony going to win or was Augustus or Octavian going to win? So he kept him with both. He more sided with Antony, actually, and Cleopatra, because they were more oriental. They were based in Egypt, which was just up the road. Herod had to pay taxes to Antony and Cleopatra, for instance. And when Augustus won the Battle of Actium, he said, okay, you're the emperor, fine. And he established good relations also with Augustus. But what's so interesting about Herod is that he was ethnically not Jewish, we would say. He was an Idumean through his father, who was called Antipas. And Idumean is the Greek equivalent of Edomite, or from Edom. Now, the Edomites were a particular Semitic tribe who believed they descended from Esau, the elder brother of Jacob. So they were very proud of their ancestry. They said, no, we're not Jews. We're Edomites. We descend from Esau. You're the younger brother lot, and you're crazy. We don't follow your... And they stayed pagans right up until even the time of Herod the Great. They had temples in Idumea. We know where its capital city was. And that's been found by archaeologists. It's now in Israel. And they worshipped a fascinating god called Kos. And they had temples to this pagan god and goddesses. But some of them, in the time of Antipas and slightly after, had converted willingly to take on aspects of Judaism. So Herod he had pagan Idumean roots. His ancestors had probably converted to an aspect of let's call it moderate Judaism. And if that isn't enough, his mother came from the Nabatean kingdom, of which Petra was the capital and was a full-blooded Arab. The Nabateans are very interesting. They were pagans, again, worshipping Arabic pagan gods and goddesses. And they were in touch with the people of the whole of the Arabian people. But they were very sophisticated. They had an urban culture based in Petra, which is now in Jordan. And again, pagan temples. So Herod was descended from them. So I think he was very proud of his pagan roots. And what I've discovered is he was often visiting his neighbouring realms, and he was happy when they dedicated a statue of King Herod in the pagan temple. We found some of these statues on the base. It says, I dedicated to King Herod the Great this statue, and it's in a pagan temple, right? So he also built one of my favourite sites in the whole region, a place called Panias, which is where there's a cave sacred to Pan. It's in what now is the north of Israel. It was then in the very north of Galilee. It's the far north of Galilee, beyond the Sea of Galilee. And it was in the terrain of one of Herod the Great's sons. When he died, he split his kingdom into three, and it's where Jesus used to go with his disciples. It was his safety refuge place, Panias. And it's where the famous exchange took place when Jesus said, "Who do you think I am?" And the disciples went round in turn saying who he was. And Thomas is the one that says, "I cannot say." And Jesus says, "You're the one that got it because you've drunk from the same bubbling brook that I've drunk from." And this is a core text in the Gnostic tradition of Thomas. Jesus wasn't saying, "Look, hey, look at me, I'm the Son of God, I'm great." He was saying, "No, I've drunk from the stream of gnosis. I've reached an enlightenment experience. I'm grounding that, and I want my disciples and everyone to appreciate that. I want you to all become citizens of the kingdom of God." And that was why Thomas said what he did. So, and it's really interesting, this exchange took place in Panias, which Herod Philip, the son who controlled that terrain, renamed Caesarea Philippi, which I've been to, amazing place. So I think Herod was a very complex character. He also appreciated the gods of Rome. He was pious. His view of piety was to honour and respect all the religions of mankind. He respected Augustus's god, Jupiter and Minerva and the gods of Rome. He respected also the Greek deities. He had many Greek-speaking friends. He spoke Greek himself. His name Herod means, a gift, a divine gift in Greek. So, from Hera, who's the wife of Zeus. So I think he was far more sophisticated than people realise. He was learned in Hellenistic thought as well as Semitic thought. He would have known his biblical traditions as well as the local pagan traditions. So I think one has to read the history of Herod the Great to really understand what Jesus was born into. My reading of the Jesus materials is that he was also much more sophisticated than people realise. And I speculate in my commentary, wouldn't it have been fascinating if Jesus and Herod had actually sat down and had a chat? That would have been fascinating. Because I think ultimately they were on the same side. They both wanted peace and they wanted respect for all peoples. But of course Herod, in a sense, turned to the dark side, using violence, and his family politics got out of control. He killed his two of his sons. He was paranoid about power, and so that's why Jesus said, "No, my kingdom's not like that. I'm not a king of this earth. My kingdom is the kingdom of heaven." So there was a differentiation. But anyway, I'm weaving that into the commentary. It's fascinating stuff. And then another thing I just want to plug, this short book. Fast forward, we come to the Emperor Constantine, making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. I think Herod would have fallen out of his chair, could he foresee that? But it was all down to this woman, Helena, or Helen, who was the mother of Constantine, who seems to have been a Christian before her son, and who, according to this author, Evelyn Waugh, a great Catholic novelist, actually, famous novelist, she was a British princess. There is a tradition that she was from Britain. I mean, there's no proof, who then ended up in a different part of the empire and met Constantine's father, Constantius, who was posted in Albion. So it's obviously a historical novel. It's a reconstruction. And the most exciting thing Helena did was go to the Holy Land and find the true cross. She found the actual cross on which Christ was crucified. And Evelyn Waugh does a lot of sleuthing. I mean, the book is based on a lot of historical research. how's that possible? How could she have found it? He weaves the narrative brilliantly. It's absolutely fascinating. And then also, just to say, my next read, when I finish the 10 books I'm currently reading, is this book, also by Evelyn Waugh, about Edmund Campion, after whom Campion Hall in Oxford is named, where my colleague and friend Gavin Flood is based. And it's the Jesuit College of the University of Oxford. Because Edmund Campion was a great scholar and a Jesuit. He was there in Oxford in 1603 when Queen Elizabeth came. He started his life as an Anglican, but he ended up feeling the Anglicans were too compromised and wishy-washy, so he became a Jesuit, and he was a brilliant scholar. And ultimately he was killed, martyred, and you know, that I think is a stain on the otherwise sensible settlement of tolerance of faith that had happened in the Reformation of Britain. So I'm looking forward to reading what Evelyn Waugh makes of Campion, who was trained in Douai in I think it's now Belgium. It was a great seminary where they trained priests and things. So that's some of what I've been up to. A couple of other things. Just doing my normal library duty here in the village. Working on the Love Journal, which is coming out soon. Watching with interest the Canadian new Prime Minister dealing with the Trump thing. And a sensible man. He was the governor of the Bank of England for many years when I was living in Britain and teaching. I even suggested he was worried where should he send his children to school, a Canadian guy, but he was living in London. And I said, why don't you send them to St Mary's Cairn, which was a very good Anglican school where I was teaching in Wiltshire. I don't know if he ever did, but I did suggest to the headmistress she contact his children. Not sure if they ever went. Mark Carney, yes. Safe pair of hands. I think he'll guide Canada very well and hopefully win the next election and, see off this Trump madness that is just, I think, mentally unstable, actually. So we have to approach it as a medical problem. I'm also listening to Hannah Arendt's work on the origins of totalitarianism. 30 hours of listening, because it's a classic, and she's a great philosopher, 20th century philosopher, Jewish, but of a very ecumenical, sophisticated, level, and was from Germany. A brilliant philosopher in her own right, and she, after the war, she managed to get out before the Holocaust started, rounding up Jews. She got to America, lived in New York, taught there, and she eventually wrote this book, I think in the late 50s, because she was puzzling over how did Germany and the European fascists suddenly go into totalitarian mode, and why did Stalin do what he was doing? Because she was on the left politically, and yet she wondered how on earth was Stalinism and Hitlerism possible. What is it about totalitarianism? Where did it come from? And since we've got a recurrence of that kind of way of thinking in Trump's America with Doge and, my word is the law and you can't fight it, I think it's very important to go back to Hannah Arendt and look at her analysis of it. She's very good on analysing the origins of anti-Semitism, for instance, which is the first part, which I'm looking at now, and how that was an indelible part of the rise of totalitarianism, both in Soviet Russia and in Germany, because what she says is that certain kinds of rogue intellectuals who decided that race was the most important thing in all of history, not class, like Marx said, and not generational conflict, like James Fasey said, but race. They did an alliance with the mob, because the mob can basically be turned any which way if you pay them enough or just broadcast enough propaganda at them.
What, excuse me, what is mob?
The mob, c'est la foule.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. the kind of the crowd mentality, the mob. And so Hannah Arendt says that this is the tragedy of the birth of anti-Semitism. And I think we're seeing that again. The internet has become a vehicle for mob whipping up, and with Elon Musk and his misuse of X and the purchase of mass media, like we've seen in Britain with Farage, these racist people that demonise Europe. I mean, I was brought up in Britain to love Europe, and we used to come to France for holidays. My mother was a Francophile. I loved all Europe. I read classical history and Greek and Roman history. I mean, I thought of myself as a British European and, a cosmopolitan. And it never occurred to me that my country could suddenly become anti-European racists in the mode of Farage. What Hannah Arendt would say is that's what happens when the mob is whipped up by fake intellectuals for their own nefarious ends, which is to create division, and fundamentally to get power. So anyway, I'm researching that. I'll report back. I've also been listening this week to Plato's immortal dialogues, the Theaetetus and the Phaedo. The Theaetetus is a brilliant survey of what is knowledge, and it's a beautiful discussion. Theaetetus was a mathematician, actually, and then he's discussing with Socrates, how can you really know what is knowledge, as opposed to just opinion. There's some brilliant lines in it, which are very relevant to my work on being and knowledge. And then the Phaedo, which is a very moving, the last few hours of Socrates' life. His disciples are around him, one of whom is called Phaedo, and they've tried to persuade him to run away. They'll say they'll get him a boat, he can escape to wherever he wants, and he refuses. He says, no, I'm a law-abiding citizen. I was sentenced to death. I'll serve my sentence. I don't agree with it. I'm innocent. But, I'm not going to run away because that makes me look guilty. And they have a discourse with the students about the immortality of the soul or not. Because there are some people there that don't believe in it in the group, think that when you die, that's it, you just die. Others that think, well, maybe there's something to it. And of course, it's so, extraordinary. It's on the verge of his own death. And he, of course, says, look, I'm going to argue for the immortality of the soul. And yes, I'm sort of biased because I'm about to die, and I hope that it's true. But towards the end of the discussion, I think most of the disciples come round to that view as well. He gives some very, very good proofs, I would say, for the immortality of the soul. Logically, rationally, he argues. And he follows a chain of discussion that I kind of worked out for myself when I was living in Canada in my early 20s, reading my first ever readings of Plato and the Gospels and all the rest. I studied all this stuff in detail. I'd not been brought up to be particularly religious. My parents were from a humanistic background, more Sartrean kind of approach on life, more Marxist inspired. And, we have to face the harsh reality of life, but even so we can live ethically and wisely. You shouldn't depend on the immortality of the soul to persuade you to live wisely. But when I was in Canada, I worked out that now I think actually probably the immortality of the soul is probably factual. And I reached it through a series of logical analyses, which are very similar to what Plato is having Socrates go through. So that's fascinating, and if you haven't read it, I recommend it. The other thing I've watched with horror, like the whole planet, is the Musk Doge bandwagon rolls on, and now they've crushed the US Institute of Peace. They've sacked all the staff, and this is a sister institute to my own, in effect. I've always wanted a British Institute of Peace in London. I'm the holding operation for that. I'm absolutely astonished that Trump thinks he has the right to sign these executive orders destroying an agency that was founded by Congress, many, many years ago. And that depends, it's partly generates its own funding. It's not reliant only on Congress, but Congress supports it financially. There's nothing to do with the president. And yet he's taken to himself this totalitarian power of destroying these institutes. He's now got his eyes on the Smithsonian Museum, for God's sake. That's been there since, I think it was James Smithson, a great British guy who lived in France and then went to America, a scientist. This is just a fanatical madness. And I think, where does it come from? I've been agonising over how can these people think what they're doing is right? And then I watched a programme of Democracy Now!, one of the best news channels in America, about Elon Musk's background. And he's part of this group that grew up in apartheid South Africa, where racism was the law, white supremacy was the actual official law, and the black people were, Untermenschen. They were second class, third class citizens. And so the whites had tremendous privilege, power, money, servants, property, and his father was from that background. And so was Peter Thiel, who is from that same group. And Musk and Thiel and others who are named in the interview, they're all a South African apartheid mafia. My jaw dropped as I'm watching the programme, and I'm thinking what they've done is they brought apartheid-style thinking into America. They've then married it to the old sleeping, Confederate ideas of white supremacy, which are long buried, long gone, but they've revoked them, re-invoked them successfully. And so you've got the old Confederacy has come out of its graves and marching the Great March with these apartheid-style white South African racists. And where is the union? It's unbelievable to watch how they're doing it. And of course, they're very clever. They use the internet like a weapon. And they've got Steve Bannon and all the other unsavoury characters who've been profiting. And this Marjorie Taylor Greene, this woman in Congress who turns out to have an absolute Nazi guy on her payroll as her head of PR, has just been exposed today in the press. These are people that look back on Hitler as the greatest guy ever, and they're all anti-Semites, of course, because they praise white supremacy. Now, to me, this is an intellectual impoverishment that's going on in America. I had a dear friend who was a Jewish professor of theatre studies in America, one of my best friends ever, who'd been a member of a thing called the Phi Beta Kappa Association, which I discovered. I did some research. That's if you're very intelligent in an American university, you get invited to join the chapter. It's a bit like Freemasons. And it means you're spotted as a real intelligent person, male or female. It's been going since 1776. And it only exists in a few of the universities. They don't all have chapters. And of people invited, only about 1% will be invited. Anyway, this dear friend of mine was a member, and she was, I have to say, probably the cleverest young academic I've ever known. As a friend, we used to have incredible conversations. And so I just thought I'd look up Trump's academic record when he was at university. Was he ever a member? And what I discovered, because you have to have like a very high, consistent sort of A-star type results to get invited to join this thing. Trump's results are so bad that he's forbidden anyone to have access to them. And he's threatened to sue his University of Pennsylvania, where he studied at the business school, if they release them. He's threatened them with legal action if they release his transcripts and his results, because they're obviously way down. He doesn't want to be exposed as a academic nincompoop, which is what he is. So I'm just thinking, this is the problem we've got here. What do you do when people like that get control of the levers of power? I think Plato discusses this in the Republic. I'm not sure if he